like to thank everyone for being here today. Welcome to Virtual Mental Health Mondays, where we explore topics that affect our health and well-being through a holistic and creative lens. I'm Kimberly Kirklin with UAB Arts and Medicine, and our mission is to enhance healing and well-being both in healthcare and community settings through arts and creative expression. If you would like to, as I mentioned early, if you want to put in your name in the chat and where you're Zooming from, we would love to see that. And please note this is being recorded. So if you don't want your likeness on the recording, you can feel free to turn off your camera, but we'd love to see you. And also, please note that we would love to hear any questions that you may have. So please feel free to drop those also in the chat throughout, and we will get to them. But today we're going to discuss some really powerful work that's going on with the Wallace Center for Arts and Reconciliation right down the road in Harpersville, Alabama. The Wallace Center is it's located on the site of a former plantation and works to cultivate racial healing and repair through community dialogue and reparative interpretation of the place's history and people. And so today we'll be joined by Jennifer McConnell, the Programs and Facilities Manager. She's also an artist. Artist and filmmaker Elizabeth Webb, and Salaam Green, poet, author, and our inaugural poet laureate for the city of Birmingham. And she's also a member of the UAB Arts and Medicine team, which we're so thankful for. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And that was a wonderful introduction to the work of the Wallace Center. I'll just add that the organization was founded in around 2019 by two of the descendants of the place. The current executive director of our organization is also a Wallace family descendant, a white Wallace family descendant. And in 2018, she inherited the house that is now the site of our organization. And after conversation and connection with some of the Black descendants in and around Harpersville, in particular, in a conversation that she had with Mayor Theo Perkins, who is descended of the place, they decided to start this nonprofit to try to change the narrative that has been known about the particular plantation there in Harpersville and about plantations in general. So our goal is to center the narrative of the lives of folks who were enslaved on the place, their lives afterwards, and to perhaps have conversation that can lead to reconciliation between those particular Black and white descendants, and perhaps act as a model for conversations elsewhere in the nation. That's all from me for the moment, unless there are questions at this juncture.
Oh, well, that is great. Thank you. Oh, did we have a question? All right. Thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to Elizabeth.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here with all of you. I see some familiar names in the chat. So, and some of you who have participated in this project as well. So it's great to see you all here. So I'm Elizabeth Webb. I'm an artist and filmmaker, originally from Charlottesville, Virginia. I also work for an arts nonprofit called Arts in a Changing America that focuses on cultural equity and really the intersection of the arts and social justice. So have done a lot of sort of community engaged work from a nonprofit perspective and then also from an arts perspective through my independent arts practice. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, as I said, in a predominantly white context. And I always was really questioned about what I was. People ask me, "What are you?" all the time. But it wasn't until I was 18 that I found out that my father had been passing as white, and that there was a black side of my family that we weren't supposed to know about. So the sort of process of meeting that side of my family, talking with my dad about his decision, talking with that side of my family about my dad's decision, sort of happened alongside my process of becoming an artist. So that sort of personal context really informs the way I sort of move through the world as a Black woman with white presenting privilege. And that's a whole other talk, but we won't we won't get into that. But I'm happy to answer questions about that too, if they come up. But a lot of my practice also deals with land. Land as this sort of container for the many layered histories that exist in our country and around the world. And I think about the scholar Saidiya Hartman, who talks about landscape as a witness to histories that might exist outside of the archive, the sort of formalized archive. And she talks about using landscape as a witness specifically to stories of Black women who are often excluded from the traditional formalized academic archive. And that sort of framework for engaging with place has really stuck with me, and influences the way I think about my own family history, but then also these other sites of engagement. And so basically, I actually met Nell when I was in Houston. And Nell, it was actually right around the time that she inherited the Wallace House. And so we sort of started conversing. So I was sort of there from the beginning in a sort of sense. But originally, I was actually invited to do an installation inside the house. And I decided that that wasn't actually where maybe I could be of the most use. A lot of my arts practice, and specifically my work through the arts nonprofit that I mentioned, deals with thinking about how we can sort of provide tangible community benefit, which isn't always a thing that is thought about in the arts. Oftentimes people sort of separate aesthetic experience from like tangible community benefit. It's either community work or it's artwork, and it often can't be both. And I think it can be. And there's many people who think it can be too. And so, yeah, so I sort of thought, well, actually, this is an opportunity to think about tangible community benefit in Harpersville, specifically around the Black descendant community of the Wallace House, and thinking also about sort of this tangible community benefit from a reparations-based framework. So what are the things that sort of historically, systemically, and through to the present day, the Black descendant community wants and needs and envisions for a sort of more just future? So I felt that my role as an artist was really to engage with the Black descendant community and find out what people wanted and needed, and use this opportunity of the formation of the Wallace Center as this sort of infrastructure that could perhaps provide some of those things that the community really wanted and needed. So I started this process of creating this sculpture called With Love for Grief, and began a series of informal conversations on porches, with notably the porch of Peter Datcher and the History House, and sort of informally gathering folks around conversations around reparations and what reparations could actually look like on a sort of hyper-local framework, or hyper-local scale. And two sort of main themes emerged from those conversations. One was that people really wanted a formal site and sort of formal expression that included the names of their ancestors who were enslaved on the site of the Wallace House. And people also were really interested in scholarships for the youth. And then I will say that Salaam started joining on a number of these community conversations, and we started doing them together, and that has been an absolute joy having her involved with that process. And so the challenge was to think about how we could do both of these things: create scholarships, which are sort of monetary things, and then also create this site of formal acknowledgement and remembrance for ancestors. And I remembered a story that Nell had actually told me early on about when she was a child growing up and visiting there in the summers. And she would see on the columns, they would have a list of names. And the names were actually of people who had attended house parties there in the early 1900s. So there are a number of sort of notable folks who came from that place, and among them is Henry Walthall, who was a white actor, and he is sort of most known for his role in Birth of a Nation film. And so he would often visit that place in the summer and would bring other folks from Hollywood, other folks locally, and they would have these sort of house parties on that site. And the columns became this record of presence, notably white presence at those parties. And so I just sort of had that story in my back pocket because I thought it was sort of an interesting anecdote. And when I heard about this desire to sort of memorialize the names of enslaved ancestors, I thought about the ways that white partygoers had sort of recorded their own presence on that site. And so I asked Nell where the columns were, because they had been sort of removed during the restoration process of the house. And she said, well, they're sort of rotting out back on the ground. And so I said, well, could we use them? And she said yes. And so then became a process of sort of working with these columns. And it was important to me that these columns actually, each of them is a tree, or was once a tree. They were at one point cut down by either enslaved people or descendants of enslaved people on that site. And they were squared off. Each of them is a poplar tree. They were squared off and to sort of support this plantation home. And at the time that we sort of began to engage with them as objects, they were really quite rotted. There are these huge cavernous sort of gaps in them, which was why they needed to be replaced for the structural integrity of the house. But these gaps and these sort of channels were really interesting to me. And so we started to think about what they could sort of be filled in with. And I should say that also the names of the partygoers were not visible at the point that we started working with the columns. The story sort of really remained, but the physical names were nowhere to be found. We could not find any trace of them on the columns. It's possible that they had been painted over or were with pencil and had been erased somehow, but they were not there. And so Theo Perkins, actually Mayor Theo Perkins, said, well, what if we filled the gaps in with metal, something shiny, something that's not sort of an attempt to make the column look complete, but actually emphasize the sort of gaps, emphasize these channels. And so I started looking into that. And so we were able to work with Sloss Furnaces in Birmingham. All of you are probably very familiar with Sloss. And we were able to work with them to fill in these gaps in the columns with aluminum. And so they sort of now are these sort of trees that have pieces of aluminum in them. I think Jennifer has some images that we can share in a bit. But then in terms of the sort of thinking about the names, we thought, well, what if we work with the descendant community to have them inscribe their own presence onto these columns? So at homecoming, at the annual homecoming that the Wallace Center has, which brings together white descendants and Black descendants of that place for sort of communion and celebration, we invited the Black descendants who were present to inscribe their own names on one of the columns. And so they signed their names with Sharpie, and then I sort of painstakingly went over each line and carved out. And then we also, in January, actually had a separate event with the Black descendant community where we invited them to sign the names of their enslaved ancestors. And so then we had a number of folks join and sign those names as well, which was really a sort of meaningful event. And then again, it was the same process of sort of carving over them. And now the columns are currently being installed upright among the grove of trees that is still sort of in visual relation to the front of the house. And it was important to sort of have them among the trees because, again, as I said, the columns were once trees. So sort of returning them to their original purpose on this earth as living objects, living beings, I should say. And yeah, so the scholarship element then became, we thought, well, how do we sort of tie this to a scholarship idea? And I knew that both Nell and Tom, her cousin, who are both involved with the Wallace Center, were interested in creating some kind of scholarship fund at some point, but it felt like this was sort of a moment to kind of start it off and make it happen, even if it wasn't going to be as like huge as eventually it hopefully will be. And so we, as a material of the sculpture, we decided to create a scholarship fund that is equal to the amount of money that was invested in the aluminum pouring. So this material that sort of begins to fill in the gaps. And then there's this sort of parallel scholarship fund that happens that, again, will hopefully grow over time to support the descendant community and others in the area. And then the last thing I'll just say is that the title of the sculpture is With Love for Grief. And Grief actually is the name of one of the people who was enslaved on the Wallace House site. And so we were sort of, Salaam and I know when we first sort of read her name on this record, it was kind of this very poignant experience, thinking about this. Of course, we have no sort of real context around her naming, but the name Grief holds so much in terms of the context of her existence and life as an enslaved person on that site. And so we dedicated it to her, with love for grief, sort of wanting to channel the love that is very much a part of the descendant community. It's sort of being put into this project and process as well. Because for me, the sort of, while there is this final object in a certain way, there is this sort of physical sculpture, the process of creating the sculpture, the process of having all of these meetings, informal conversations, formal conversations, all of that is actually part of the art project in in a way that is sort of equally, if not more important than the final end result object. So that's what I'll say, and then we'll pass it to Salaam.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And absolutely, I look forward to, I think Jennifer has some pictures to show towards the end. But I was so excited to be invited on this project. It's sort of like, how did I get to be a part of this? And I know Elizabeth, many years before I even came on, was like conceptualized this project and this whole entire experience. But I'll just start at kind of how I was invited to get on the project, and then I'll share some of the poetry that came throughout the project, and then the whole process. Because like Elizabeth said, part of my process as an artist and part of her process as an artist and part of our process with Nell and with the Wallace Center was really working on the process. We knew that those columns would be upright and they were coming. I know Elizabeth's like, did you really know that? Yes, we knew that they were coming. We had a deadline and we had some dates, and you know how that goes, and we scurried through those, but we knew they were coming, but because of the processes that we were going through. And so I started working at Vincent middle school some years ago through the Alabama Writers Forum. And through that, I met Nell because we were doing a unit on the Wallace Center. It's the Wallace House at the time. And the unit that we were doing was on the Great Frontier. And part of the Great Frontier was really helping students to realize in Harpersville that the Great Frontier, the whole passage of America, came through Harpersville. And really to talk about the whole historical aspect of living descendants of the Wallace plantation and the Wallace House and the Wallace Center are there today. And are people who are many people who are in their own families, and many people who they pass by, many people who they see at the Dollar General, many people who they see, every single day. And so we were able to bring in speakers such as Peter Datcher, such as Nell Gottlieb, such as Mr. Henry Smith, such as Theo, the wonderful mayor and pastor, and all other things that he does at the school at the time was as a bus driver. So we were able to bring in descendants and descendants that were near to the Wallace House to actually talk about not just the Great Frontier, not just the great passage that was happening at the time, but the whole idea that of living descendants, and that the students were part of living history, and Harpersville was living history. Many of them pass by the Wallace House every single day. Some may not even pay any attention to what this house is on the side of the road, next to the cotton fields, next to the auto mechanic shop, next to all of the wonderful other things that they see close to the cemetery. And we were able to bring that to them as well. So part of my role, once Elizabeth kind of found out I was doing that, she asked and invited me, and Nell invited me to come and to support the project a little bit more through doing community conversations. And my role during these community conversations was really to work on what I call historical empathy. When we look at history, we want to not just only, as you know, look at the facts. We don't want to just only look at current and past horrors or horrific pitfalls of the past. But as we're looking at that, we want to take the lens of historical empathy. And so for me, as a poet and as an artist, everything I do is from the lens of a historical empathetic vice. And so this project is a historical empathy project where I really looked at using mourning as monument. And so part of grief, the whole name of grief, Wallace actually being the name of one of the people who were one of the women who was a human who was enslaved, being her name, really looking at mourning as monument and looking at historical empathy as a process for artistic expression and a process for racial healing, and how we can bring together the art, the racial healing, and the historical empathy kind of as a threefold or three-pronged process towards bringing attention to the community, as well as right now you all, towards what really happened at that time, but also how we're now transforming and recreating that space with the columns. And so some of the things I wanted to share with you today that's very important for me are some of the poems that came from some of the work that I did at Vincent Middle School, and also share some of the poems that we hope to share during the dedication. Poems for grief, poems for Grief Wallace, poems that we really want to bring into play that talks about and honors kind of the historical empathetic vice that we're using and those kinds of things. So our first community conversation that I was part of started pretty early, like Elizabeth said, they were the quintessential front porch conversations, the quintessential, in the community conversations. But very importantly, we did the first conversation during Juneteenth where only Black descendants were at the Wallace Center, and for the very first time together, Black descendants without the white descendants were able to have a community conversation. And as we know, these opportunities, were always there, but we had an opportunity to kind of through this project and through the columns during Juneteenth as well to bring that to play. And what was really exciting was, like Elizabeth was saying, those bare columns were out in the middle of in front of the Wallace Center. And as those bare columns were out in the front of the Wallace Center, Black descendants, intergenerational Black descendants, I would say, I think the youngest were twin boys who maybe at the time were 9 months. and the which was like so mind-boggling. They were sitting on the laps of their uncles and their great grandfathers, who were some of the older descendants, who were, of course, probably in their late 80s. And so really having an intergenerational model for historical empathy, having an intergenerational model where during Juneteenth, Black descendants were able to come and talk about what types of reparations or reparation activities, or what would a reparation model look like today. And out of that, like Elizabeth said, came the whole idea of scholarships, and came the whole idea of scholarship committees and scholarship coordinators, and how all that can look and what all that needs to look like. But mainly what came out of there was just this beautiful opportunity for Black descendants walking the land, talking through the land, and actually looking at the columns and deciding, whose names were to go on the columns, where those names were going to go. Got an opportunity to sand down the columns, to actually feel the wood from those original trees, to be amongst the trees themselves as well, where those columns are going to be placed. So like I was saying, this process of historical empathy, this process of mourning as monument, this process is organizing around artistic expression for racial healing. It's something that Elizabeth and I strategically, step by step, not came up with, but there are models, 100 models out there. We're just modeling what others have done so beautifully throughout their communities for racial healing. But we brought that to Harpersville, and through the whole wonderful work that the Wallace Center already has been doing in bringing community there through their homecomings. And so for me, before we turn it back over for some pictures and some questions and answers, I just wanted to read a few poems, if that's okay. And these poems are historical empathy poems that really kind of sit on the edge of historical empathy. And when I say historical empathy, that's just caring about history from a human perspective, right? Doesn't mean that we aren't like apprised to the facts, as we are. Doesn't mean we aren't apprised to, really focusing on the scholarly and academic parts of the historical narrative. But it's really looking at how we reshape that narrative with the lens of concern, with the lens of empathy, with the lens of, okay, I'm coming at when I look at the columns, and when you get a chance to see the columns when they're upright, or when they're even laying down, or when they're flat on the ground, you're coming at it from the perspective that this was a tree. Somebody sat underneath this tree. There was an opportunity, probably at some time, where leaves kind of fell off of this tree, and they fell on the feet of Grief Wallace, perhaps. Gives you an opportunity to imagine and to actually revisit that space, to revisit it from the lens of people who lived there, people who worked there, people who were attached to the land, Black women attached to the land, whether through working or labor. And now it gives you an opportunity to imagine and revisit it as a space of monument, as a space of rest. And so I'm going to read 3 poems maybe and be done, because people always ask me now, do I have a poem? And today I do. But most of the time I'm like, no, I don't have one. But today I do. And this is a poem for Grief Wallace. And I will also say, as we were doing this work, many of the wonderful practitioners of the work are cultural organizers, like Peter Datcher, Theo Perkins. Everyone in the community is a cultural organizer or a cultural worker. And repetition, they say, is the mother of invention, right? And these stories that we hear, and the stories that you continue to hear, and you hear from Elizabeth and Jennifer and all the wonderful descendants who are on here today and all throughout Harpersville, you're going to hope that you hear repetition, because that repetition allows you to remember. And because you remember, it becomes a way that we reinvent and recreate and reshape and reform our empathy. Our empathy is something that should grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, just like those trees and just like those columns that represent those trees. So if repetition is the mother of invention, then we also know that repetition is the mother tongue of memory. And this is for Grief Wallace. This is a poem about the liberated, freed from imprisonment, slavery, or enemy occupation, bearing witness to those who fought to be liberated for their own liberation. Freedom from limits on thought or behavior, liberation from the pain of loss, grief, regret, and loneliness. You see, freedom is what others may choose to give you, but liberation is what you give yourself. This is a poem about church, not the steeple and the tithing basket, but the church of the holy, living, liberated people. The real church. The church that replaces pews with chairs that encircle one another, putting the bodies of humanity beside each other. The church that practices grace without guilt and allows the anxious to relinquish their anguish, to fall into the arms of love, accountability, and lavish in the omnipresence of repentance. This is a poem about grief, tending the roots of her pain, uprooting the wounds of her forgiven shame, reclaiming the power of her name, being set free from every one of her chains, from every one of her chains. For grief, Wallace. And lastly, I want to read a few poems from the students who probably are going to have, from the students at Vincent Middle School, who are probably going to be some recipients of some of the scholarships, or at least going to be part of some of the scholarship committee coordination and all those kinds of things, as it is the school that students and folks have graduated from and go to in Harpersville. And the last anthology that I edited for them is called Voyages, an anthology of poems. It's from the Writing Our Stories project for Vincent Middle High School in Vincent, Alabama. And these are sixth graders. And Nell came to speak. Nell Gottlieb, who's the executive director, came to speak, I think, last year. And one of the things I remember her saying to me, and maybe she said this to them, but she was saying, I really want the students to have empathy. I want them to feel for those persons who were enslaved, for those persons who came from Virginia to Alabama, those persons who were on those wagons. I want the students to experience empathy. And so I'm going to read two poems from those students who I believe in the sixth grade experienced some empathy as they heard these stories. And now I think as they're going to see those columns for the first time when they go back this year. So the first poem is by Jordan Blake, and it's called Ripples. This is Ripples, written by Jordan Blake. The boats make ripples. The ripples travel endlessly on the water. There are boats on the water. There are mothers on the boats. There are children in the mother's arms. When we talked a little bit about what happened and how some of the enslaved people got from Virginia to Harpersville to build the Wallace House, and how that house was built on enslaved labor, and we talked about many of those things, Jordan asked, Miss Green, when they were on the wagons, I bet that there were babies, and I bet there were mothers. What happened to the mothers and what happened to the babies? And I asked her, write a poem about it. That's what your poem is about. And the last poem I'm going to read comes from Cameron White, and it's called My Family. So one of the best experiences the kids had, and most best is not grammatically correct, but whatever. The best experience, it's like, I have to be a little bit better now. But one of the speakers that the kids would not stop talking about was Peter Datcher, right? So Peter Datcher, if you haven't met him, he has the History House as well, and he's really wonderful and has a film and just all these beautiful things. So you all know Peter Datcher. But Peter came in and he actually brought artifacts from farming in the 1800s that the kids could touch, that was rusted and old and that they could see, and he had them kind of name, like, okay, this is what we made shoes out of, and they had no idea what it was. But he also told his story about how I would say is my great-great-grandfather, how many removed, I'm not sure, who worked for over 50 years as an enslaved man, that was enslaved, as a man, a human that was enslaved. That's what he was, and that's who he is. And he talked about how he worked for over 50 years and never got paid any money, not one dime. And for some reason, as a teacher, sixth grade, I thought that would just go over the kids' heads. But for the entire year, they could not stop talking about how unfair and how they did not believe that that could happen. And so I asked Cameron White, who was so concerned. He was so concerned about Mr. Thatcher's great-great-grandfather. He was like, Miss Craney, he didn't make it. I was like, this is no enslaved people who were enslaved did not make money. So yes, that was Mr. Thatcher's family. That was also Mr. Smith's family. There were my ancestors. There were all Black ancestors. That's what happened. And he looked and he said, well, he was a fraud. He just was, there was the empathy. And there was also some sadness. And then here comes the way that we recreate and reshape and turn that empathy into power and into action, just like those columns that Elizabeth formulated and turned into power and action, just like this process that we turn into power and action through the idea of the artistic expression that the Wallace Center is doing. He turned it into a poem. And so Cameron White's poem is called My Family. My Family, a poem by Cameron White. I am of the Thatcher family. I am 11 years old. My mom and dad are in slavery. They work late hours. Mom has blood marks on her fingers from picking the cotton. I wash her fingers at night in alcohol and warm water. She kisses me good night. She kisses me good night. I see my grandfather in slavery. I see no slavery today. I see two women screaming, shouting, and jumping up and down on a porch. I see the joy they have in their actions. I see we own the same land for 200 years. I see there is joy in land. There is joy in living. I see there is joy in land. There is joy in living. Thank you. Turn it back over, I guess, to some pictures and some questions. Thank you all.
Oh, wow. Thank you all. That was just wonderful to hear about. I know, well, first of all, I will ask Mark if you will go ahead and share those two photos so we can see those and see what they're talking about. But I would love to open. I see we have Nell here. I see we have Mr. Datcher. I see, and I'm recognizing some names that I've seen, and I just wanted to see if anybody wanted to kind of unmute and share anything additional or share what this experience kind of was like to be a part of this process. And yeah, it's just.
I would love to add in one other bit before we begin taking questions, if I might.
Great.
I think that it's really important to connect this to your general topic of mental health. And it is super important to the mental health of individuals, communities, nation states to tell the truth. And one of the biggest parts about this particular project and all of the projects and the work that the Wallace Center is trying to do is that, centering a truthful narrative, a more complete story, and that is what I wanted to make sure that we highlighted and connected to. So,
Thank you so much, Jennifer. But yeah, I think Mark, you can go ahead and show those photos now.
and I'll give those some context as well.
Oh, great, thank you, Jennifer.
Mm-hmm. So what we're seeing are images from the day when the Black descendants gathered and wrote the names of some of their enslaved ancestors on the column. So this is just the columns laying out to the side at sunset at the house. There should be one other image that will give you a little closer up view of the names that the Black descendants wrote, and that Elizabeth then etched in with her trusty Dremel tool. So if we can show that next image, we may get a better sense of those names. So as you can see, you may be able to read some of those names, but Lucy, Herod, Grief, those names are listed there. And then at the bottom of the column, it says, and I'm paraphrasing a little, but, and to the many more names that are unknown, right? So it's a wonderful memorial. The dedication will be Saturday at the Wallace Center in Harpersville. If folks are interested in coming to that event, please go to our website or follow us on Instagram for a little bit more information about that. Now, that's my spiel, and we're open for questions.
Awesome. And Jennifer, actually, we're able to show the information about the upcoming events, the artist talk that's going to happen. And of course, the celebration. And so people can find out more by going to wallacearts.org. Is that right?
That is correct. And the artist talk that you mentioned is going to be done at Sloss Furnaces in collaboration with Sloss. As Elizabeth said, the aluminum was poured at Sloss. So we're doing a partner event with them, and that will be Thursday evening at 5:30. So come out and join us for that as well. Elizabeth, Salaam, and I will be joined by Tony Bingham, who is another Birmingham artist who also has a site-specific sculpture at the Wallace House.
Wonderful. And I do want to open it up to others, but I did want to ask if people wanted to find out more about the scholarship program, or wanted to get involved with the Wallace Center, would you recommend going to the website?
Excuse me. So when you visit the website, there are a couple of ways for you to get engaged. You can sign up for our newsletter, which would give you updates on information, events and information that's happening, and or you can donate to the Wallace Center. There's a link there to do so. Similarly, you can reach out to me directly, Jennifer McConnell at gmail.com. I'm happy to put that in the chat for folks who would like more information about tours or coming out for other kinds of events.
Wonderful. And yeah, so I don't see any specific questions in the chat, but I did want to open it up to anyone else who has had a role in or participated in this project.
Well, I'd just like to say, this is Nell Gottlieb from the Wallace Center, that relative to art and healing, anybody who has seen Elizabeth's work, we just, listen to the words of Salaam roll over us. The same thing with Tony Bingham's project. Art has the power to move you to reflection. And I have to say, personally, that's been my theme over the last years. So I recommend that everyone come out and experience it in person on Saturday.
Wonderful. Anybody else want to share a little bit? I know we've got some folks on here that were participants and descendants. No? Oh,
I would make a comment. As a nonprofit, the Wallace House needs donations. It can't be just a few people. But most importantly, a donation, even a few dollars, represents your true interest. It's a little bit more effort than going on a Zoom call, but represents true interest. So I would encourage you to pass that on to your friends.
thank you.
Speaking of, this is Pat Bell, and speaking of the donations, perhaps I didn't hear, but if one were to donate on the website, is there currently a way to designate a donation for scholarships, the scholarships that you've revealed today, that program?
There isn't specifically, but there's a tribute side, and you could put scholarships in there, and we'll go into the website and have a campaign that you can put in for scholarships. Right now, there hadn't been one, but wonderful idea, Pat. Pat Citizen of Harpersville. The first person who mentioned donations is a friend of mine, Joyce, who came out for Weidman Davis dance back in 2020 and has been our friend ever since, from Houston.
Wonderful.
I also want to go. I'm sorry. I also want to shout out to Theo Perkins, my cousin. We share a Harpersville great, and Theo and I found each other through a DNA match on Ancestry.com, and it didn't take much work to find out how we were related, and the day that we sort of went public with that on Facebook was amazing to both of us, because so many people responded with joy, amazement, a whole range of comments and emotions. And that is what started my connection to Harpersville, was just simply an Ancestry.com DNA test. And within a year or two, Theo introduced me to Nell, and we took it from there. It's been a joy.
That is an incredible story. Thank you. Elizabeth?
Oh, I was going to say, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but my adopted grandpa, Peter Datcher, always has a few words to say. And so would like to specifically invite you to speak if you want to.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
My granddaughter know if I was there, I'd spank her for throwing me home. Y'all, I would love to be able to talk, but once I get started, you might as well go get dinner and supper, because you'll be here a while. I am enjoying this more than you would know. Those that are speaking, like my adopted granddaughter and my little bossy daughter, Janelle, she keeps me straight and informed. But this is what I want everybody to do. Whether you originate here from Wallace or from the county or from the state, honor your ancestors by saying their names, by looking them up. Honor your heritage. And then do the research that gives you an understanding of the history, and especially Black history. Trust me on this. It is way more than you would believe. Simply saying slavery does nowhere near include all that it entails. Okay? I'm not going to talk long because I can go on for 2 days. Okay? And possibly not even say the same thing. But I was honored to be a member of this organization, Wallace Center. I was honored to be a member of it. Just today, the Lord told me that I was doing the right thing in trying to give recognition to my ancestors, because what I discovered and what I had been told growing up, that they went through so much more than I could have imagined. The first, I will say this and I'm going to get off. The first time when I started my research was because the first day I realized that my great-grandfather, Albert Baker, and his wife, Lucy Wallace Baker, had been enslaved for how many years. At that time, I misjudged it, but I realized that he had been enslaved since 1825 when he was born, and she was born 1840. When I realized how long that was without being paid, and then I looked at what he had accomplished afterwards, the land that we were on, the church that he had founded, all after this, I realized his name had to be said. I realized that when I started the research, we did not know where we descended from as Datchers, who gave us that name. And when I realized from my research that just two people were the father and mother of all Datchers in this state, right there in Harpersville, in Vincent area, I said, oh my God, this is what? I, I, I was overwhelmed. Please do your research. Take the time to go online. It costs you a little. Ancestry.com, that's the one I live on. And I found out so much about our people that it was overwhelming. And I found out that everything I had been told, all the documents that my family had left behind, the pictures, it was all true. It all matched. And that's why you see Peter do what he do. All right, I'm through.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that.
I just want to acknowledge Mr. Peter Datcher, my history brother. I just learned I was his adopted daughter, which is nice because we're the same age. But he's the moral center of our board. He was on the founding board. And I just want to say that, Peter, that's who you are.
And Peter, we
Thank
have
you, Neil. Thank you, Neil. That's my little sister. And she watches out for me. And she sold me 100% that day when she said something to me. I won't say it now, but she said something to me that was historic, that I had never heard before. Never heard a white person say that they realized what she did, what she said about our ancestors and her ancestors. And from that day on, she's been my little sister. Don't mess with her now. I ain't but 6'6". All right. Well, unfortunately, I'm 70.
Well, Peter, I think you have inspired some other people to go to Ancestry.com based on the chat. But we only have a few minutes left, and I just wanted to see if we could hear from Elizabeth and Salaam about what's next for you, just in general. Any new projects? What's going on? Elizabeth, you want to start? Or Salaam, you're off mute.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start and let Elizabeth in because she's the curator of such these beautiful projects. And so going forward, I will be an artist in residence this year with the Wallace Center. So with Jennifer Nell and Peter, you get to see me more, I guess. It's like, I don't know, the rest of the descendants as well. So that's artist in residency coming up, where I'll be doing some poetry and hopefully some installations or some kind of way of honoring descendants through poetry. We'll be doing that as well. Also, I am a fellow for the Wyman Davis Fellowships alongside with Peter, who's a fellow as well. We will be having in March the 2nd and March the 9th. There will be some, if you go to their website, we will be having presentations of some of the things that we have done. You get a chance to have an opportunity to go to the History House and other types of spaces. But other than that, I'm the poet laureate for Birmingham. So please look me up and look out for events. And I'd love to see you in the city. So thank you.
Thanks, Salaam. That's very
And Salaam, your upcoming book.
Oh, yes, my upcoming. Oh, Nell, thank you. The upcoming book that Salaam has to finish writing. So I have an upcoming book that is slated for summer of 2024 that is will be healing in Harpersville, where I've interviewed and done some stories, heard some stories from story keepers in Harpersville, and I wrote original poems from those descendants. And that book will be coming out on Pulley Press, a national publication, this summer 2024. And we'll be doing some things. I know, Nell, Jennifer, and Peter will be doing some things. We got things in the works. So y'all don't get rid of me that easily. And Elizabeth and I are we're always working together, and we are BFFs. So
Well, I hope y'all will consider coming back on as guests to talk about that book.
we're here. You know where to find me.
Yeah. And Elizabeth, please share.
Yeah, so I actually also just released a book that I co-edited with two of my colleagues at Arts in a Changing America. It's called Future Present, Arts in a Changing America, and it's published by Duke University Press, so that's available. I also have a show up right now through the beginning of July at the Jewel Collins Smith Museum in Auburn. So if any of you ever make it down to Auburn, check it out. There's some other really wonderful shows up at the same time as well. And then I am working on a feature film, my first feature film. So that's sort of what I have in the cooker.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That's really, really exciting. And Jennifer, what about you? What do you have coming up, either with the center or with your own art? Is she still? Is she still on?
I thought I saw her.
Well, we will, we can follow what she's got going on at the Wallace Center. But again, thank you everyone so much for being here. It was an honor to share Zoom space with all of you. And of course, Elizabeth, Salaam, and Jennifer, Nell, Peter, everyone who's a part of this incredible organization and all doing incredible work. And our next Virtual Mental Health Monday will be March 18th for a conversation on the growing role of arts in medical education. So again, thank you all, and take care.